Poor teen Lent, his only notebook. What happened next changed his life forever. He never imagined that giving away the only thing he trusted with his dreams would drag him into the darkest days of his life. When those pages left his hands, so did his confidence, his security, and the fragile hope he guarded like treasure. But the world wasn't done testing him. Not even close. What happened afterward would nearly break him. Before revealing a twist so unbelievable, it still leaves people speechless. Listen closely, because this single act of kindness became the spark that turned a forgotten boy into a name worth remembering forever. He had grown up believing that dreams were a luxury only the wealthy could afford. Yet despite the worn shoes on his feet, the thin shirts he outgrew too quickly, and the constant hunger that followed him like a shadow, he carried one priceless treasure everywhere he went. A battered, fading notebook that held every ounce of his hope. It wasn't much to the world, but to him, those pages were the only place where his future still felt possible. Inside it were carefully written class notes, sketches of ideas he prayed would one day become inventions, and whispered hopes scribbled late at night when the rest of the house slept. He wrote in that notebook like it was his last lifeline, because in many ways, it was. Without it, there was nothing left to prove that he was capable of more than the poverty that tried every day to suffocate him. And then, one afternoon when the sky felt heavier than usual, a classmate approached him. Pale, trembling, desperate. They needed help, urgently. Their own materials were gone, and they begged to borrow his notebook, promising to return it quickly. For a moment, he froze. Lending that notebook felt like cutting open the only vein keeping him alive, because everything that mattered lived between those pages. Tension crept into his chest. What if it got damaged? What if it never came back? What if this act of kindness cost him the future he'd been fighting for his entire life? Voices inside him screamed to say no. Fear clawed at him, reminding him that people like him couldn't afford to gamble with anything, especially not something so important. But kindness has a way of overpowering logic. He saw the shame in the classmates' eyes, the panic in their voice, and despite the storm inside him, he handed over the notebook. Slowly, carefully, like giving away a piece of his soul. The moment it left his hands, a chill ran down his spine. Something felt wrong. An uneasy silence pressed on him, whispering that he'd just taken the biggest risk of his life. And maybe, just maybe, he had made a mistake that couldn't be undone. But what he didn't know then was that this tiny act of compassion was only the beginning of a nightmare he never expected, and a miracle he could never have imagined. The next morning, he arrived earlier than he ever had before. His shoes were still wet from cutting through the frozen grass, and the cold clung to his clothes like need itself. But he didn't care. He was fueled by a small flutter of hope, the belief that the notebook would be waiting for him. Maybe it would be tucked neatly on his desk, maybe handed back with an awkward smile, maybe returned before anyone even noticed it was gone. He sat perfectly still, listening for footsteps that never came. As the minutes dragged on, the classroom filled, chatter swelled, and laughter echoed. But one sound was missing, the voice of the classmate who had borrowed his notebook. Their chair stayed empty. He tried to swallow the sinking feeling building in his chest, telling himself they were simply running late, that everything would be fine. Hope lies sometimes, and he desperately needed its lies. By the end of that first day, the tiny shred of confidence he'd clung to began to fray. By day 2, it snapped completely. No student, no response, no notebook. He checked every hallway, every corner, every seat in the library. Nothing. His voice grew tight when he asked around, because every time he admitted he'd lent out the only thing he owned that mattered, he felt like he was confessing foolishness. And then the whispers began, thin, sharp blades disguised as harmless comments. How could he lend the only thing he has? He must have been trying too hard to look kind. It's his fault if it's gone. Those who didn't whisper simply looked at him with pity, as though he was some hopeless creature who didn't understand how dangerous trust can be. And with every stare, every whisper, something fragile inside him cracked. He tried to rebuild what he lost. He spent hours hunched over scraps of paper, forcing himself to rewrite his notes from memory. But the scribbles felt lifeless and incomplete. His handwriting grew messy, dark circles bloomed under his tired eyes, and frustration left tense marks across his jaw. His mother noticed the change in him and gently asked if he was all right. He told her he was just tired. He couldn't bring himself to admit that everything he'd worked for was slipping away. Teachers began noticing the silence in his seat. They called on him, demanding answers, asking for assignments he could no longer produce. His explanations were small and trembling. I lent my notebook. I'm trying to rewrite everything. Some teachers nodded stiffly. Others stared with disappointment. But all their faces seemed to say the same thing. You shouldn't have helped anyone. Deadlines piled up like storm clouds. Incomplete work grew into a mountain he couldn't climb. His grades began to drop, slowly at first, then faster like an avalanche. Every missing page became a missing mark on his record. Every undone assignment felt like a shovel of dirt burying his future. And the fear that he was falling apart tightened around his lungs. Then one afternoon, a teacher delivered the harshest blow yet. If you don't recover that notebook soon, you'll lose any chance of a scholarship review. The word struck like lightning. The scholarship wasn't a reward. It was his lifeline. Without it, everything would collapse. His dream of college, the relief his mother prayed for, the promise he whispered to himself that poverty wasn't his destiny. Losing the notebook didn't just mean missing notes. It meant the disappearance of his one escape. He searched harder. He checked the office. He went through attendance records. He even waited by the school gates after classes ended, pretending he wasn't hoping to see the classmate turn up. But there was no sign. Rumors spread faster than truth. Some said the student's family had moved towns in the middle of the night. Others claimed the notebook was ruined, lost, or sold. Each version twisted the knife deeper. Sleep shrank into an hour here, a restless nap there. Food became an afterthought. He found himself staring at ceilings in the dark, replaying that moment, the moment he handed over everything that mattered. Why didn't he say no? Why couldn't he act selfish just once? Loneliness wrapped around him tighter with every day. The notebook remained gone. Poverty had always been heavy, but losing the notebook made it suffocating. He was drowning in the belief that his future was crumbling piece by piece. And yet, the most brutal blow hadn't arrived. Not until the counselor asked to see him. He sat down in her office, hands trembling. A tiny spark inside him wanted to believe she might have good news, or at least comfort. Instead, her tone was heavy with resignation as she spoke. You needed that notebook for your final evaluation portfolio, she said. Without it, your scholarship eligibility is compromised. You may need to accept that you've lost your only chance. The words crashed into him like a collapsed roof. Lost his chance because he tried to help someone else. He nodded quietly, swallowing every scream clawing at his voice. The counselor didn't mean cruelty, but every syllable scraped across his heart. Kindness doesn't always come back to you. she murmured. Sometimes it leaves scars. He walked home in silence that evening. No wind, no footsteps, just a hollow quiet that pressed on his back. He pictured his mother counting coins, deciding which bill could wait another week, reminding him softly that education was the only escape the world had ever given them. And now that door had slammed shut, because he dared to do a good thing. And through all of it, even with his world splintering into cruel fragments, he did not hate the classmate. Confusion, yes. Hurt beyond measure. But hate never bloomed. A small part of him still wanted to believe that the borrower hadn't meant to destroy him. He still wanted to believe goodness wasn't a trap. But destiny had already taken notice of the notebook he'd lost. Somewhere beyond his sight, hands had opened those pages. And soon, those scribbles he feared were gone forever would begin rewriting every part of his future. And soon, he would learn that the true cost of losing that notebook wasn't measured in grades or scholarship points, but in the unimaginable chain of events waiting on the other side of heartbreak. Days bled into one another, and life began to feel like a long corridor with no doors. Bills now lay stacked on the kitchen counter like silent threats, and his mother moved around the house with weary footsteps, doing her best to hide the heaviness she carried. He could feel the tension in every room, the kind born from poverty's relentless grip. The notebook had been much more than paper. It had been his weapon against failure, his proof that he deserved a life beyond hunger, debt, and fear. Without it, he was naked in a storm. Assignments were now impossibly incomplete. Test preparation felt like climbing a mountain with broken feet. His essays, the ones that used to win quiet praise from teachers, were gone. Not because he never wrote them, but because they all lived inside that missing notebook. That little book had held pages filled with research, carefully drafted scholarship responses, outlines for competitions, and personal reflections that could have been his ticket out of obscurity. Every time he remembered one more thing that had disappeared with those pages, it felt like another piece of his destiny had been torn away. Soon, even walking the school halls became painful. Teachers grew sharper, asking questions that he couldn't answer without the work he'd once proudly written. His grades, once stable enough to earn him hope, now tumbled so fast he couldn't gather the pieces. Some teachers pulled him aside with stern warnings. Others looked at him with sadness, as though they were already watching the slow demise of a promising future. Then came the hardest blow yet. A notice pinned on the scholarship board. Students shortlisted for academic review were being evaluated based on a portfolio of notes, essays, and long-term work. Work that, for him, existed only in the notebook that was gone. His heart nearly stopped. That notebook had been his portfolio. Those pages weren't just memories. They were evidence of his talent, his discipline, his grit. Without them, he was just another struggling kid. Another invisible face passing through a system that rarely noticed the poor. He tried to explain to the scholarship committee that the work existed, that he had poured everything he had into those pages. But the committee wasn't cruel, just coldly procedural. They needed proof, documentation, physical results. His words, no matter how heartfelt, weren't enough. All they could tell him was simple and devastating. Without those pages, there is nothing we can evaluate. The weight of that sentence pressed on him long after the meeting ended. It didn't just threaten his education. It threatened everything. Because education wasn't merely a choice for him. It was the only bridge to a life where heat wasn't a privilege, where dinner didn't mean rationing food, where his mother didn't have to pretend she wasn't hungry so he could eat. Without the scholarship, He'd be forced to leave school, take any job he could find, and surrender his childhood dreams to the reality of survival. His world narrowed to a single, suffocating truth. The notebook was gone, and so was everything inside it. He reached for solutions that never came. He tried rewriting the portfolio by memory, but memory is cruel when pressure suffocates it. He would sit alone at night, clutching a cheap pen, begging his mind to recall the exact phrasing of essays he once wrote with pride. But thoughts tangled, words blurred, and doubt slithered into the spaces hope used to fill. The walls around him seemed to close in tighter with every attempt. Sleep no longer came easily. Nightmares replaced dreams. He woke with his heart racing, sometimes reaching beside his bed for a notebook that wasn't there. His room felt empty. His backpack felt lighter in the worst possible way. The absence of that notebook became physical, like a missing organ that left him gasping. Then came news that struck harder than any rumor, any whisper, any grade slipping through his fingers. A final reminder email from the scholarship board arrived, demanding full submission by the end of the week. Without the notebook, there was nothing to show. No content to present. No history or effort that proved who he was. Time was running out. And it wasn't just his academic life collapsing. It was his family's livelihood. His mother's exhausted smile grew thinner. Bills and rent weighed heavily on shoulders already bowed by hardship. He could feel the quiet panic in her voice every time she asked if things were going all right at school. He hated lying, but what else could he do except pretend? For him, the notebook hadn't simply gone missing. It was dragging everything down with it. His education, his reputation, his future, his family's fragile hope. What he didn't know was that while his life felt like it was being stripped away piece by piece, something unexpected had already begun. Somewhere far from his despair, beyond the halls where his reputation was sinking, beyond rumors, beyond his sleepless nights. That notebook was no longer lost, and the person who found it wasn't treating it as a forgotten item. They were reading it. And as they turned each page, discovering reflections, brilliance, and pieces of a soul that refused to break. The boy had no idea that what he'd written in pain was about to ignite the greatest turning point of his life. While he dragged himself through days thick with dread, certain that life was watching him crumble without mercy, that missing notebook quietly resurfaced in a place he never would have imagined. It didn't return to the student who borrowed it, nor did it lie abandoned under broken lockers or get tossed into trash bins. Instead, it passed into the hands of someone who had absolutely no idea how much it meant, and even less awareness of the boy who had poured every part of himself into its fragile spine. It came into the possession of a school administrator first, collected with lost items after a classroom sweep. Most forgotten books are flipped through lazily and dismissed without a second thought. But something about this one made them pause. Perhaps it was the worn cover that had been reinforced with cheap tape. Perhaps it was the way the notebook seemed heavier than paper should ever feel, as though the weight of a soul rested inside. Or perhaps destiny simply refused to let those pages die in obscurity. Whatever the reason, instead of being tossed aside, the notebook was set on a desk, unnoticed at first, then quietly waiting for the right eyes. Eventually, curiosity got the better of someone. A hand opened to the first page, expecting nothing more than ordinary notes. Instead, their eyes froze. The opening pages were filled with reflections written with startling clarity. Not childish entries, not doodles, but thoughts that cut straight to the heart, vivid, humble, profound. Notes wove between paragraphs of incredible depth. The anatomy of kindness, the quiet psychology of loneliness, memories described with delicate precision, dreams laid bare without apology. His handwriting stretched across the page with a hunger to be understood. What began as a casual skim turned into transfixed reading. There were passages about poverty that sounded like lived poetry, observations about human behavior that revealed compassion sharper than any lecture could teach. Pages filled with problem-solving ideas, inventions to make life easier for the elderly, proposals for safer roads in his neighborhood, sketches of affordable water filtration models for struggling families. There were confessions of fear, too, and unguarded admissions of how heavy it felt to be a son fighting against the same poverty that bruised his mother's bones. It was impossible to scroll past the lines or glance casually. This was the writing of someone who understood the world's brutality, yet still chose kindness over bitterness. The administrator passed it on to a teacher. The teacher passed it on to a counselor. Soon, a circle of educators gathered with that notebook at the center, whispering, debating, and rereading certain lines as though each sentence carried sacred weight. In a world full of paperwork and predictable essays, this was different. The notebook revealed a mind that refused to stop questioning, a heart that refused to harden, and a will that refused to surrender even when cornered by circumstance. More people read it. A few widened eyes. Some blinked back tears. Others looked around the room in disbelief. No one could understand how such insight could come from someone so young. Someone attending their school, walking their halls, living quietly under their noses. They began searching for the owner, driven not by curiosity alone, but by the fierce conviction that the writer deserved to be seen, perhaps even saved. The notebook eventually found its way to a woman known for her stubborn advocacy, a member of the district's Youth Development Board. She sat alone in her office long after sunset, reading the notebook with the desk lamp casting gold over the pages. Hours passed unnoticed. She hung on every line. She paused to press her hand against her chest as though to keep her heart from breaking open. She read descriptions of nights spent studying in silence, because the sound of hunger in the household made concentration nearly impossible. She read about a mother who pretended she wasn't hungry, so her child could eat first. She read the boy's quiet promise to succeed, not for himself, but to repay the woman who sacrificed everything just to keep a roof overhead. Tears didn't simply well in her eyes. They fell freely. The notebook was more than notes. It was a monument to endurance, a map of a mind fighting tooth and nail against the chains of circumstance. A boy's voice on paper that deserved a microphone. She closed the notebook only when exhaustion blurred the lines. But afterward, she sat very still, with one conclusion echoing through her entire body. They had to find this boy. Not later, not eventually. Now. Meetings were arranged. Staff began to compare handwriting samples against class assignments. Quiet inquiries were made with teachers who might recognize the writing style. His name surfaced faster than anyone expected. Multiple teachers immediately identified him. It wasn't shocking in hindsight. The boy had always given more effort, more attention, more heart. He was quiet but not invisible, just overlooked. Once confirmed, urgency replaced curiosity. Discussions rose like wildfire. How could they help him? How could they protect his future? What doors could they open? Some suggested fast-tracking a scholarship. Others proposed mentorship. A few wanted to publish excerpts of the notebook as proof that brilliance walks quietly through even the poorest corridors. And while they built plans, drafted proposals, and prepared to contact him. He lived in the opposite emotional universe. Every morning, he woke believing the world had punished him for being generous. Every night he cried silently, wishing he had been colder, more selfish, more guarded. With each hour that passed, he believed more deeply that poverty had swallowed the last good thing he had. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly imagine, was that his words were traveling without him, that strangers were speaking his name in reverent tones, that his thoughts had stirred hearts and awakened advocates. He didn't know that while he sat grieving his lost future, a future bigger than anything he'd dared to dream was already forming. Not because someone pitied him, but because the notebook he once feared was gone forever had started a revolution on his behalf. By the time administrators finished debating, they were no longer asking whether to help him. They were strategizing how to do it best. Who needed to be in the room when they met him? How to present the opportunity with dignity? How to ensure this moment would be the turning point that rewrote the trajectory of his entire life? And all the while, he remained unaware, walking the same halls, breathing the same anxious breaths, and bracing himself for the consequences of kindness he believed had ruined everything. Because while he thought his world was collapsing, destiny had already opened its arms. And the moment they finally called his name would hit him so hard, it would steal the breath straight from his chest. It happened on a morning that felt heavier than all the rest. A morning when even the air seemed to sag with exhaustion. He woke before dawn, not because he was eager for the day, but because sleep had abandoned him long ago. His eyes burned from too many nights spent forcing himself to rewrite lost notes, and his body ached from carrying burdens too big for someone his age. He grabbed his backpack, now painfully lighter without the notebook he once guarded like gold, and walked to school with numb steps. He was certain nothing waited for him anymore except consequences. Missed assignments, failed checks, sharp reminders that kindness had cost him more than he could afford. By the time he reached the school building, a dull hopelessness had attached itself to him like a second skin. He kept his head down in the hallways, avoiding the eyes that once mocked him, but now seemed to ignore him altogether. He moved like a ghost among the living. And then, out of nowhere, a sound cut through the hallway, a crackling announcement from the intercom, sharp and urgent. "Please report to the principal's office, immediately." The sentence came like a blow to the chest. For one terrifying moment, he thought this was the final collapse. That his teachers had given up on him, that maybe he was about to be dismissed, expelled, or formally removed from scholarship consideration. His hands shook despite his attempts to steady them. Students glanced at him with raised brows as he walked past. Not mocking this time, not pitying either. Something quieter, something curious. Almost like people knew something he didn't, and that only made the dread worse. Every step toward that office felt like walking through thick mud. When he reached the door, he paused to breathe. But even the air refused to fill his lungs properly. Inside the office, the world seemed to tilt. Around the principal's desk sat several adults he didn't recognize. Dressed too sharply, sitting too still, watching him with a seriousness that pierced straight to bone. Their faces were impossible to read. Not angry, not disappointed. Something stranger, something that made his pulse hammer harder. And right in the center of the desk lay his notebook, not tossed or neglected, not stained or torn, but placed carefully, respectfully, almost reverently, like it was an artifact pulled from ancient ruins. He stopped breathing altogether, one of the unfamiliar adults, a woman with warm eyes and a trembling hand, gently slid the notebook toward him. "We've been looking for you," she said softly. He stared, stunned, words trapped behind disbelief. "How? Where?" His voice cracked under the weight of all the nights he'd spent praying it wasn't gone forever. They didn't answer with a location. They answered with impact. They began explaining how one person read a single page, then another read more, and how the notebook slowly began circulating because nobody could put it down. They spoke about finding honesty that echoed like confession, intellect that felt generations older than his age, and vulnerability that carved open something inside every person who turned those pages. And then came the word that shattered his fear. Brilliant, not talented, not capable, not promising. Brilliant. They told him that his writing carried emotional intelligence many adults never acquire, that the discipline etched into his notes and essays mirrored the work ethic of scholars, that the compassion in his reflections revealed a rare gift, the ability to see humanity without bitterness, even while being crushed by life. He blinked rapidly, not from pride but from disbelief. Everything inside him wanted to collapse, because for the first time in what felt like an eternity, someone saw more than poverty when they looked at him. They saw a mind worth lifting, a young man worth believing in. Then came the question that nearly broke him wide open. "What do you want from your life? Because we want to help you reach it." The room fell silent. He opened his mouth, but the words tangled under the weight of so much shock. He had spent weeks preparing for failure. He never prepared for hope. With a trembling voice, he whispered, "I just wanted a chance to keep learning." The woman who had spent nights reading his notebook shook her head gently, eyes glassy with emotion. "Oh no," she murmured. "You deserve far more than just a chance." They spoke of scholarship opportunities, not the single one he had feared losing, but multiple grants, personal sponsorships, academic pathways carved out by people who believed in him because of his own words. They described mentorship programs, invitations to writing workshops, leadership academies, and even small publishing opportunities. They said the notebook hadn't just impressed them, it had changed them. One man in the room leaned forward, voice low but trembling. "These were not the thoughts of a student trying to pass a grade," he said. "These were the thoughts of a young leader, someone who sees the world clearly." For a moment, the boy couldn't speak. His throat tightened, his vision blurred. Every word they spoke felt unreal, impossible, out of reach. The principal, who had watched him walk the halls with quiet determination for years, finally smiled. Not out of pity, but out of pride. "You worked hard in silence," he said. "And sometimes the world needs a reminder that greatness grows in places it was never expected to exist." Then came the sentence that would echo in the boy's memory forever. "You didn't lose your future when you lent out this notebook. You revealed it." They told him his notebook was going to be locked in the school's archives as an official piece of academic excellence, that his reflections would be used to inspire student programs, that the scholarship committee, who once doubted him, now wanted to rebuild his future around the power of that notebook. The woman who read it first wiped tears from her cheeks. "You wrote about hunger as though it was a teacher," she said. "You wrote about pain as though it was a sculptor. You wrote about kindness like someone who understands its cost, and anyone who sees the world that way deserves every door opened." They pushed the notebook toward him again, and this time he picked it up slowly, reverently, like someone reclaiming a heartbeat. His fingers traced the bent corners, the ink stains, the tiny tears of paper. It felt like holding the past, the present, and the key to everything still ahead of him. He closed his eyes, fighting back tears. Because that little book, the one he once feared had destroyed everything, had instead become his lifeline, the proof of his value, the bridge between who he was forced to be and who he was meant to become. But destiny wasn't done. Because even as opportunity flooded the room, even as his world began stitching itself back together in ways more beautiful than he ever dared to dream, something even greater loomed on the horizon. Something bigger than scholarships, bigger than recognition, bigger than any future he ever pictured for himself. The notebook had started a spark, and the fire it ignited would soon spread far beyond that office, farther than the boy, or anyone in that room, could imagine. And just when he thought he had reached the miracle's peak, the final twist, the one that would transform his entire existence, was waiting to explode into his life next. The days after that meeting didn't feel real. They felt borrowed, gently taken from the kind of life he used to watch from afar, belonging only to those who had the safety of wealth, the comfort of stability, the reassurance that tomorrow wouldn't crumble. Now those days belonged to him. For the first time since childhood, he didn't wake with dread tightening his lungs. Instead, possibility seemed to flicker around every corner. Meetings with educators turned into meetings with district officials. Meetings with district officials evolved into calls with scholarship boards, foundations, and community sponsors. Men and women in crisp suits leaned forward, genuinely asking what he needed to thrive. Not survive, thrive. His voice mattered now. His ideas mattered. And most astonishing of all, people listened. He had spent his entire life shrinking inside poverty's walls, believing that silence was survival. Now, silence wasn't enough to contain him. He was slowly being ushered into a world where his thoughts were welcomed, invited, and celebrated. But nothing compared to what happened next. A week after the assembly announcement, the school hosted a special event. It was framed as an academic recognition ceremony. But behind the scenes, everyone knew it existed because of him. Teachers who had once scolded him now pulled him aside with soft apologies. They whispered that they never expected someone so quiet, someone so overshadowed by hardship, to possess a mind that held so much fire. Students who used to overlook him stared with wide eyes, suddenly aware that they had been walking the hallways next to a boy who wrote like someone twice his age and carried the world like someone infinitely older. He was guided backstage, notebook held tight in his hands, nervous, trembling, overwhelmed. The air seemed thicker than usual, heavy with anticipation, curiosity, pride. When his name echoed through the speakers, something seismic seemed to shift. The crowd's applause rolled forward like a wave, crashing over him until he could hardly tell whether the tears in his eyes came from shock or gratitude. As he stepped onto the stage, the lights nearly blinded him. Yet even through the glare, he saw hundreds of faces tilted up toward him with expectation and respect. They weren't mocking. They weren't pitying. They were attentive, hopeful, even humbled. He wasn't invisible anymore. The principal began by telling the story of the notebook, not as an accident, but as a turning point. He spoke of rediscovering brilliance where nobody thought to look. He told their city that hope often grows in silence, especially in the hands of those who have nothing except their determination. He declared that this young man's notebook would be permanently preserved as an exemplar, proof that genius and compassion can be born in the tightest corners of hardship. The advocate who had first spent nights reading the notebook stepped forward. Her voice shook as she told the audience how each page had changed her, How parts of the notebook made her take long pauses to collect herself. How it reminded her that poverty is not a measure of worth, and that brilliance is often carved out by struggle, not privilege. She said the writings inside that notebook haunted her, comforted her, challenged her, and ultimately inspired her. Then she turned to him, eyes bright with conviction, and thanked him, truly thanked him, for lending that notebook at all. When they finally asked him to speak, the microphone shook in his hands. His breaths came unevenly. But when his voice rose, thin and fragile, the entire room hung onto every syllable. He spoke of growing up in a home where bills dictated the rhythm of life, where hunger stood at the door, where cold nights made dreaming feel like a rebellious act. He explained why the notebook meant everything, that every word inside it had been written with the belief that intelligence could be his escape, kindness his compass, effort his rebellion against a world determined to keep him small. And then he admitted the hardest truth. When I lost this notebook, I thought I had lost everything I was, everything I could ever be. Silence stretched like sacred cloth. Not a single voice dared interrupt. He told them that kindness almost felt like a mistake when consequences struck. But as his eyes scanned the crowd, he felt something deeper moving inside him. Something strong, unshakable. That notebook didn't cost me my future, he said. It carried me straight to it. And it taught me something I'll never forget. Giving away the little you have will never make you smaller. Sometimes it makes the world bigger. The applause was explosive. Standing ovations cascaded through the hall. Teachers cried openly. Students who once ignored him clapped until their palms burned. But the greatest shock was still ahead. After the ceremony, he was guided into a meeting room where the advocate, principal, and several serious-looking strangers waited. They explained that his notebook had been reviewed far beyond the school's walls. Education officials, independent donors, and national scholarship committees had read excerpts. Their response was overwhelming. A full scholarship had been approved, not just for high school, but for the entirety of his university education as well. His tuition, books, living expenses, and academic materials would be fully funded. They wanted to ensure that poverty would never again stand between him and his potential. And there was more. A prominent youth innovation program, a highly competitive mentorship initiative, offered him admission without application. They wanted him to be trained, guided, and connected to leaders who could shape the world. They wanted his ideas nurtured, his voice amplified, his compassion preserved as part of leadership training. But the final reveal nearly dropped him to his knees. A group of private donors and educational partners proposed a long-term fund in his name. A support program to provide notebooks, school materials, tutoring, and scholarship assistance to hundreds of low-income students every year. They named it in honor of the boy who lent his only notebook without second thought, not because his notebook alone inspired them, but because his generosity did. The movement started small, a few boxes of notebooks donated to nearby schools. Then it grew. Businesses offering supplies, community leaders raising funds, teachers hosting reading sessions based on passages from his writings. Within months, more than 300 students received aid. Soon, that number would reach thousands. He attended the first community event, stunned and quiet, standing before long tables lined with journals, backpacks, pens, even study guides. Volunteers worked alongside educators, handing resources to children and parents who had known a lifetime of scraping by. And every time someone asked why the program existed, the answer was simple. Because one boy lent the only notebook he owned and reminded us what kindness can do. He saw children clutch notebooks the way he once did, like anchors, like lifelines, like promises. Some eyed him shyly, others stared up at him with silent admiration. He realized they weren't seeing a poor kid who once lost everything. They were seeing proof that their dreams didn't have to die in poverty's shadow. Weeks later, as part of the scholarship celebration, the school displayed selected pages of his writing behind protective glass frames in the hallway. Students stopped to read the passages. Some whispered. Some wiped tears. For many, it was the first time they'd seen someone who understood their struggle articulated with such honesty. Someone who came from where they came from, who felt what they felt, and still rose. And in the quietest moment of all, long after the events, long after the applause, late at night in his room, he sat with his notebook again. The familiar weight rested in his palms. His thumb brushed the creased cover. He opened it, page by page, reliving every thought, every fear, every dream. He remembered the day he handed it over and the days that followed. The humiliation, the heartbreak, the belief that kindness had destroyed him. But now he saw everything differently. He saw that sometimes the world takes what you treasure just so it can give you something greater. He saw that compassion isn't weakness. It is the catalyst for miracles. He saw that sacrifice can bloom into destiny. He saw that lending away the very last thing he owned was the exact moment his entire life began to change. Tears finally streamed down his face, not from grief, but from wonder, gratitude, awe. With a trembling smile, he whispered into the quiet, "I didn't lose anything. I gained everything." His scholarship secured, his education guaranteed, his future rebuilt, his story shared, his voice amplified. And his kindness multiplied into a legacy that would change lives long after his own journey began. The poor boy who once clung to a single notebook had become proof that the smallest act of generosity can reshape fate itself. The attention did not arrive all at once. It started as a ripple, a few curious glances, a couple of respectful nods in the hallway, a teacher who smiled at him as though suddenly aware he existed, and a student who muttered, "That's him. That's the notebook kid." For the first time in his life, whispers did not carry ridicule. They carried fascination. At first, it felt strangely beautiful. He had spent so much of his childhood becoming small to avoid the sting of judgment, folding himself inward so no one would spot the hunger in his eyes or the frayed hems on his sleeves. Now eyes were turning toward him for a reason he could be proud of. His name surfaced in conversations. People spoke of him with warmth and admiration. After school, someone from the local paper requested an interview. They asked him what pushed him to keep writing despite his circumstances, what his dreams were, and what that notebook meant to him. He answered slowly at first, unsure of what to say. But when he began speaking about his mother and the pages filled with hope he wrote late at night, he saw the reporter's expression soften. They scribbled notes with urgency, eager not to lose a word. That article spread. Social media posts followed. Comments appeared from strangers who found his story powerful, who said they needed to hear that someone in hardship could still choose kindness. One person wrote, "I was about to give up on school. His story gave me a reason to try again." Another said, "This reminds me that the world still has good people in it." Those words hit him like sunlight after weeks of storm. The idea that his pain had somehow become someone else's encouragement filled him with something he didn't have a name for, a trembling pride that felt fragile and unreal. But with the attention came expectations. More interviews, invitations from local organizations, requests for short speeches at school assemblies. Fascinated teachers asked if they could read more of his writing. A professor from a nearby university emailed, saying she wanted to meet him and discuss ways to further his education. Parents started telling their children to be like him, and students who once ignored him now approached with notebooks asking for advice. He tried to accept everything with humility, but gradually, the invisible weight began settling on his shoulders. People expected him to always say the right thing. They expected him to embody generosity at every moment, to speak like a philosopher and think like a leader, to stay calm even when fear gnawed inside him. The mention of his name came with the unspoken message that he was no longer allowed to falter. And that terrified him. Suddenly there was no room for vulnerability, no room for bad days, no room for the exhaustion that still lived in his bones. He felt watched, not in a hateful way, but in a way that demanded something from him. Eyes waited for him to act, to inspire, to reflect greatness. He feared that if he messed up even once, people would say they were wrong to believe in him. Sometimes, after events, he retreated to the bathroom just to breathe alone. He would stare at his reflection and see not himself, but this new identity others projected onto him. He would think, they see someone stronger than I am. They see someone wiser than I feel. They see a miracle. But I'm still the same boy who flinches at overdue bills and hopes no one hears his stomach growl. It became worse when the school began using his story as a symbol of perseverance. Posters with photos of him holding the notebook were displayed in the halls, with inspirational quotes taken from his writings. His name appeared in the school newsletter, stamped with headlines like "Hope Born from Hardship" and "The Student Who Proved That Kindness Still Matters." He wanted to be grateful. He genuinely did. But he couldn't help missing the days when no one paid attention, when he could quietly exist, when his thoughts were private, when the notebook belonged to him alone, instead of belonging to the narrative the world now expected him to carry. At night, when the house was quiet, he found himself staring at the notebook, feeling strangely distant from it. It was still his, still filled with the same ink that spilled from his heart. But now it held meaning for so many people that he felt disconnected from it. It had become more than his story. It belonged to thousands. He tried to keep up with everything, rehearsing speeches he didn't feel worthy of giving, answering interview questions with trembling politeness, smiling at every recognition. But under the applause, his heartbeat felt uneven. He was scared of falling short, scared that all this attention was temporary, scared someone would look closer and say, "He's not extraordinary. We made a mistake." It all built silently, like invisible snow piling up on a roof. Until the night his mother found him sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a blank page. The kitchen was dim. A single bulb blinked above them, throwing flickering shadows across the worn tiles. His pen sat between his fingers, unmoving. He had been there for over an hour. His mother, drying dishes by the sink, watched him carefully. He didn't even look up when she approached. "You're not writing?" she asked softly. He forced a smile that looked more like surrender. "I want to, but I don't know what to say anymore." She sat down beside him without rushing, without pushing. She laid her palm gently over his hand. "You used to fill entire pages in a night. You wrote about things that hurt, things that mattered. What's different now?" He stared at the paper as if it demanded greatness from him. "They're all watching now? Everyone. They want to hear something wise, something meaningful. What if I can't give that? What if I write something that's not good enough? What if I stop being the person they think I am?" His mother's eyes softened with equal, part sadness and pride. She brushed a lock of hair from his forehead. "They didn't fall in love with perfection," she murmured. "They fell in love with your heart, with the boy who kept choosing kindness even when kindness cost him everything." He swallowed hard. But what if I'm not that person anymore? What if all of this changed me? What if I disappoint them? "You're not made of stone," she whispered. "You don't owe anyone perfection. You don't owe anyone a performance. The world saw who you are because you wrote honestly, not because you wrote flawlessly." Her voice trembled ever so slightly. "And it was never the notebook that made you special. It was the hurt you survived, the gentleness you still chose, and the compassion you gave even when everything around you tried to make you cold." Her words cracked something open in him, because he hadn't realized how deeply fear had burrowed into his soul, how it whispered every night that he wasn't enough, that all of this would vanish the second he stumbled. When he finally lifted the pen, it wasn't to impress anyone. He wrote about pressure, about feeling lost in the role people handed him, about the heavy crown he never asked to wear. He wrote about how frightening it was to be admired, how lonely it felt to be suddenly known. He scribbled sentences that exposed every insecurity, writing as freely as he once did under the hush of midnight when no one knew his name. And when the ink finally stopped, relief flooded him like oxygen. His world outside of that table continued expanding. He received an invitation to speak at a youth conference, then another from a city council representative asking him to share his story as inspiration for community programs. His notebook excerpts were considered for publication by a youth development journal. But something inside him had shifted. He no longer tried to be perfect in every conversation, no longer forced words meant to sound profound. He spoke honestly, simply, exactly as he always had, even when honesty made him vulnerable. When people asked him if success made everything easier, he said it didn't. When they asked if kindness ever scared him, he admitted it often did. And when someone asked if he'd lend the notebook again, knowing the consequences, he said, "Yes, because it's who I am." But as he learned to live in this strange new spotlight, something else lingered deep in his heart, unfinished, unresolved. The classmate who borrowed the notebook. For months, even after rising through opportunities he never imagined, their face appeared in his thoughts like a faded photograph. Sometimes he imagined confronting them with anger. Other times, he imagined thanking them. Most nights, though, he imagined only silence, because silence was the only ending he had ever known. Until the universe decided silence would no longer be enough. At a donation event hosted by the program built in his name, an event filled with stacks of notebooks, tables of volunteers, and crowds of people, he saw a shape in the doorway that stole his breath. The student, older, thinner, eyes beaten down by something life had carved into them. In that moment, everything inside him trembled. All the resentment, all the memories, all the nights he stared at ceilings, wondering why his kindness had been punished so cruelly. The student's posture was small, as though they were afraid to take up space. Their hands clutched something tightly, something he couldn't see yet. Shame dripped from every line of their face, and suddenly he understood that his story didn't fully belong to him anymore until that chapter was revisited. He moved toward them, not with rage, not with righteousness, but with a storm waiting to be answered. His throat felt thick as he stopped in front of them. The student lifted their eyes with visible effort. "I didn't think you'd remember me," they whispered. He almost laughed, the kind of laugh that isn't humor, but disbelief. How could I forget? He asked. The conversation that followed untied knots neither of them had known how to face. The classmate confessed everything: the eviction, the chaos, the fear, the guilt. They spoke of reading the notebook in quiet corners, holding it tight when everything else was falling apart, and realizing they were holding a map of someone's soul. They looked at the floor as tears fell. I wanted to come back. I did. But I thought you'd hate me. I thought I ruined your future. And when I heard what happened later, I couldn't face it. I didn't deserve to. He didn't expect the sting of compassion that hit him. Yes, he had suffered. But so had they. Their story lifted a curtain he hadn't known existed. They hadn't been careless. They hadn't been cruel. They had been another kid caught in the teeth of survival, the same way he once was. You did hurt me, he admitted, voice unshaking. I lost so much because that notebook was gone. I thought I had lost everything. The classmate nodded, eyes swollen, accepting every syllable. But if it had never gone missing, he continued slowly, none of this would have happened. All of it came from that moment, even the pain. He gestured toward the donated notebooks, the smiling children, the volunteers, the foundation. I'm here because of that loss. So no, you didn't ruin me. You were part of saving me. The classmate dissolved into tears, shoulders shaking. When he leaned forward and embraced them, it felt like closing a wound that had been open for far too long. When he learned that they had dropped out of school, something inside him hardened into decision, the same resolve that once drove him to write in a tattered notebook in the dark. Come back tomorrow, he told them. The program can help you. I want you to have your chance too. The students stared at him as though seeing something holy. Why? They whispered. After everything? He smiled, tired, human, wiser. Because someone showed me kindness when I had nothing. And that's the reason I'm standing here now. I don't ever want to be the person who forgets that. The moment passed softly, but its weight would linger forever. And as the student walked away, hopeful for the first time in years, he realized something powerful. The story had never been about the notebook itself. It had been about everything that grew from the moment he chose generosity, even when generosity wounded him. But destiny wasn't done. Not yet. Because soon, newspapers were no longer enough. Interviews weren't enough. Standing ovations at school events weren't enough. His story was gathering momentum far beyond the city limits, reaching ears in places he had never set foot in, attracting people with influence he never thought would speak his name. The world was about to come knocking. And what he didn't know yet was that his story, born from a single act of kindness, was on track to explode far beyond everything he had ever imagined. And the biggest stage of his life was about to appear. He always wondered, in the quieter moments, what had really happened to the classmate who borrowed his notebook. Were they careless? Were they cruel? Did they panic? Did they sell it? Did they simply forget? He told himself not to dwell on it, but some questions cling to the mind like burrs, small, irritating, and impossible to shake. Even after the scholarships, the ceremonies, and the opportunities, the thought of that vanished classmate flickered at the edges of his mind like a shadow waiting to be recognized. Then, one afternoon, that shadow stepped into the light. It happened at a community event tied to the notebook program. The room was filled with rows of chairs, a few banners, and a table stacked with notebooks and pens. He was there, half guest, half symbol, shaking hands, offering smiles, and listening to people tell him that his story made them believe a little harder in kindness. And then, in the corner of the room, he saw a face he knew. Older, thinner, eyes tired, but familiar. The classmate. Time warped. The room seemed to blur at the edges, and every sound muffled as though he had plunged underwater. Anger surged, sharp and surprising. Memories clawed up. Sitting in classrooms with an empty desk beside him, searching hallways, begging teachers to understand, drowning in humiliation while his notebook remained missing. He thought of sleepless nights and clawed-out deadlines, of the shame whispered behind his back, of the counselor telling him he had lost his only chance because he dared to be kind. The classmate hovered awkwardly near the entrance, clutching something with shaking hands. Guilt hung on them like a second skin. For a moment, he considered turning away, letting them walk out of his life for good. But as much as past pain burned, he couldn't ignore the person who had unknowingly ignited everything. He walked toward them slowly, each step heavy with resentment, curiosity, and the faint thread of empathy that refused to die. When he reached them, they couldn't meet his eyes. Their voice was barely a whisper. "I didn't think you'd remember me." He almost laughed. How could he forget the person who borrowed his entire future? "What happened?" he asked. No anger, just a quiet ache needing an answer. Their shoulders collapsed. "I wanted to bring it back. I swear I did." Their voice shook. "But the day after I borrowed it, our life fell apart. My father lost his job. We were evicted overnight. We had to leave so fast, I barely took clothes. I kept your notebook in my bag. Every day I planned to return it, but we moved constantly. I was ashamed. I thought you'd hate me." The confession poured out, trembling, rapid, raw. "I read it," they said. "Everything. Your dreams, your plans, your hunger, your mom. I realized I wasn't just holding a notebook, I was holding your heart. And the longer I had it, the more terrified I became that I'd destroyed your life. When we passed near the school again, I left it near admin offices. I prayed someone would find it and help you. But I didn't know if it worked. I didn't know anything. And when I heard what happened later, I was too scared to show my face." He didn't expect the sting of compassion that hit him. Yes, he had suffered. But so had they. Their story lifted a curtain he hadn't known existed. They hadn't been careless. They hadn't been cruel. They had been another kid caught in the teeth of survival, the same way he once was. "You did hurt me," he admitted, voice unshaking. "I thought lending that notebook destroyed everything." The classmate nodded, eyes wet. "I know. I hated myself. I still do." He took a breath, and the truth rose with it. "But if you hadn't taken it, none of this would have happened. I would never have been found. The program wouldn't exist. These kids wouldn't be getting help. My life wouldn't look like this." Their eyes widened. "You mean I didn't ruin your life?" He shook his head. "No. You were part of saving it, even if it happened in the messiest way possible." The classmate broke. Tears fell, fast and ugly, shoulders trembling with the release of years of guilt. Before he could think too long about it, he stepped forward and pulled them into a shaky embrace. Two wounded stories, pressed together in forgiveness neither of them expected. When they pulled apart, he asked quietly, "Are you still in school?" They shook their head. "We moved too much. I dropped out. I work now, whatever I can find." He glanced at the tables, the donated notebooks, the volunteers helping children who had once walked the same path as them both. A realization emerged, bright and undeniable. The miracle he'd been given was never meant to stop at him. "Come back tomorrow," he said. "Talk to the advocate. Tell them what you went through. We can help." You deserve a second chance, too. Shock froze the classmate. Why would you do that? After everything? Because someone did it for me, he answered. And I can't ask the world to be kinder if I won't be. The guilt that once tied them apart transformed into the fragile possibility of healing. He watched them walk away, this time not as a ghost from his past, but as someone stepping toward a better future. But the world still wasn't finished with his story, because soon his life would expand beyond the city that once overlooked him. And he would face a choice that tested just how far kindness could go once the whole world was watching.